Good morning. Here we are. We're going to make a big flip-flop here today and move over into the book of Amos, the minor prophet. This is quite a switch from where we're at, and it's almost depressing as you go through this thing. Not to shut everybody off right at the beginning, but we don't really see God's grace until about the 9th chapter of the book of Amos as we go through this. And so anyway, a little bit about Amos. He was a very short, his career as a prophet was very short, probably a year, maybe even a little bit less. It was a message of doom really for Judah and Israel. And actually when you look in your Bible in that, he starts out in chapter 1, and he begins with these phrases, "Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza and 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof." And it says that about Damascus, Philistia, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and now into Judah and Jerusalem. The thing about this is that it's something that we hardly ever see, really. Well, we never see it in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, this phrase, it says, for 3 transgressions of wherever, and then for 4, I will not turn away. And that, there's a thing there that's called a Sumerian Judgment. It's from the greater God to the lesser of these kingdoms. And these things, he says, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. And that means that this is set, that this is going to happen, and there's not going to be any way out of it because God's tired of their stuff. When you read this, you see for 3 transgressions, and this lesson actually says, for 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4. When you begin to look in your Bible at typology type stuff, the number 7 is a number of completion, and it's saying there that Judah's sins, Israel's sins, the sins of these other nations are full. God's tired of it. There's not going to be any more grace poured out upon these, and we'll talk about some of these other things later on. But in the book of Amos, it says there in chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now that kind of dates that in somewhere around 760 BC, maybe 762 BC. Some things say it was maybe in the middle of the 50s BC thing. But anyway, we see there the hometown of Amos. It was a little town, or I don't really know how big it was, but it was about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, so it wasn't real big. It says that he was a herdsman. When you compare that over and I'm going to flip over there into 7, chapter 7, verse 14, where it talks about that. It says, then answered Amos and said to Amaziah, I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son. He did not go to the school of prophets. He was somebody that was somebody out minding his own business, making a living, trying to make a living the best he could. And he said, but I was a herdsman there. And that word there, it's different than the one in verse 1, because in verse 1 where it talks about he was a manager of sheep herds, and he was a developer of breeds of sheep, and here in chapter 7 verse 14 it says that he was a cattle rancher. That's what that word herdsman means there, and that's the only place that it's used there in the Old Testament. But he says a gatherer of sycamore fruit, or he was a manager, and that tells us, when we see that, we could go back over into 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4, and it uses the word sheep master there. And so we see Amos was somebody that was obviously probably pretty well off. He managed sheep. He managed cattle. He was managed sycamore fruit or sycamore figs back in those days. And it took some time to do all that. So he was a busy guy, but yet at the same time, he had the ambition, not ambition, that's really not the right word, but he was he had time he took time out of his busy schedule to hear God. And I thought that was really important about this. And it's one thing if God calls you to proclaim the good news, say the good news of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But that's one thing, but to call you out of a successful lifestyle to proclaim death and gloom and the fall of nations, and to have that kind of message, and yet do that was it spoke highly of Amos. We call him a minor prophet, but really there was nothing minor about Amos in any way. And so anyway, as we go on with this and we look at this thing, both Israel, the northern kingdom, what we call the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, they were probably at their height of power and influence in the part of the world that they live in. Actually, Israel, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, was probably a little stronger than Judah. In fact, Judah was the younger one in the bunch, if you want to look at it that way. But yet they were not younger in their sin. To begin here now, really, we're about 7 minutes into this lesson, but he says there in verse 4, we're looking at chapter 2, verse 4. And we're going to look at a couple of verses right there, right off the bat, and we've already talked about it a little bit, but it says, "Thus saith the Lord." Now remember, now this is the prophet Amos that has come from south of Jerusalem, and he is called to go to the northern kingdom, and they got this headbutting thing that's going on and been going on for a long time, and so it's kind of like Jonah being called to Nineveh in the context of this thing. It says, "For 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I will not turn the punishment away." Or, if you look in your Bible, you see that those 2 words there, the punishment, they're in italics for clarity there. But God says there, "I will not turn away thereof." And he's, again, that's that thing of this Sumerian promise here, this thing that this is irrevocable. This is not going to change. This is thus saith the Lord. This is the way it's going to be. And it's interesting to me that in this lesson, he begins with Judah before he turns his focus to Israel, the northern kingdom. And he lists the words. He says, "Because they have despised the law of the Lord and have not kept his commandments, and their lies causes them to err, after the which their fathers have walked." And when you look at that and you look at the back of it, you see that what he's talking about is a covenant that God made with Abraham. And he said that the Abrahamic Covenant, God said, "I will make you a great nation." But yet we're seeing this part here where they did not keep their agreement, that they would walk and they would obey the Lord. And they despised the law that was passed down. And actually I said the Abrahamic Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant would be more correct. But they despised the law of the Lord. It doesn't mean that they just, like instead of going 65 miles an hour, you're going 69 or 70. It's not talking about something like that. Not that I'm justifying that, but they despised it. They said, "No, I'm going to do what I want to do." And, these restrictions, this law is too much. And I'm going to go and do what I want to and disregard what God wanted for his people in that. And he said, they've not kept his commandments, and their lies caused them to err, or they erred from the truth, and then in the lies that they told themselves to make it work. They just kept going further and further away from God there. And it says, after the which their fathers have walked. And then if you go back over into 2 Kings chapter 17, somewhere in there, it says that they worship vanity, and then in the end they became vanity or worthless or useless in there. And he said, I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces thereof of Jerusalem. So we see the judgment has been passed. It's been set, and it's going to take place. It's irrevocable. This is not going to change. But yet, in the course of events here, it took a lot longer. Well, actually, if you put all the dates and all that together, 136 years before this came about, after the fall of Israel. And so here we are. It's interesting that in talking about the fall of Judah, that God just mentions this one thing, that this despised the law, they disobeyed the law of the Lord. They didn't keep his commandments and all that. But that's really all he holds against them. But in the northern kingdom, he comes back to this thing again. He delineates out the transgressions of what Israel has done, and what has got for them this same judgment that's going to come to Judah, only it's going to come a lot quicker here. And so we see there in verse 6 again, for thus saith the Lord, and we're turning now from Judah to Israel. It says, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they've sold the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes. If you go over into the book of Ruth, and you study the story of Ruth and Boaz, you can see where this thing, it says, they've sold the righteous for silver, for money, and the poor for a pair of shoes. This was a way of making a contract. You see how Boaz gave up his shoe to I can't remember who it was at this time, but it was a sign of the contract that property exchanged. And this was probably should have studied that a little bit more, but in the time frame, I didn't have time for that. But he says here that they sold the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes. Then pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek. And a man and his father will go in unto the same maid, and profane my holy name. And he goes on and he lists these things here that was what they were doing was people that were well off. I mean, normal, average, everyday citizens like you and I. We think of that they pay their bills. They walk and do every day. They have good reputations, and we find that they slipped somewhere in a debt that they may have made, and so instead of giving them an opportunity to fix that, they just foreclosed on everything and sold them into slavery. Now, slavery was never a good thing, and we know that, we understand that. Today we live in a lot different time than it was back then. But back then, that was common. It was typical. And in Israel, it had got to where it was commonplace. And it was wrong. It was as wrong then as it is now. And but you see these things that they were they would do this to anybody, and it was the people that were in control of the money and the kings, everybody was doing that every opportunity they got, and God did not like that. He was not pleased with that at all. And then they went on, and the poor for a pair of shoes. This just kept worse. And these people that were in control of things, they looked for ways to just keep pounding on to the poor. Anytime you see in your Bible, you look through your Bible, and you see the poorest of people being mistreated, God doesn't like that, and He's not going to stand for it very long. So That's a point that some of our leaders would do well to pay attention to in this day and time. It says, turn aside the way of the meek. They don't pay attention at all to people that live and walk with a humble spirit. They don't want to hear that. And I see that in this day and time all the time, that people that just want to live their life and serve the Lord and walk in that, and the arrogance, and people that they want to beat up on people like that. And we can take that as far as the scriptures go, versus the devil's crowd in the way they do. So anyway, moving on with this a little bit, going to have to move on with it. It says here, one of the other things that it says there in verse 8, it says, and they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar, and they drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. They, back in the book of Leviticus, it talks about that a cloak, which was sometimes all a person had, especially the poor, just something to keep them warm. They may give that to somebody for collateral, for a loan. But then at night, when it began to get cold, they had to give that cloak back to them. And then it says again in the book of Leviticus that for a widow, you couldn't even take that as collateral. But these people were doing it, and then they were taking advantage of people that had nothing, and then they were doing it double by taking these things instead of giving them back, and they'd go to church and lay them on their altar, and they would lay on those things that were used for collateral instead of giving them back where they were supposed to. And God just doesn't like that. I told you this was kind of depressing when we started, and he still goes on with that. He says, and yet I destroyed, God begins to talk here, and he said, this is what I've done for you while you, all the same time while I did all this stuff, you are going downhill in your treatment of your brothers and sisters in Israel. He begins to give these examples. He said, yet destroyed I the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks. And yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. God said, when you came into this land, the land of what we call the land of Canaan, or that when they came and surveyed that land, they came back, and Joshua and Caleb was the only ones that gave a positive report, and the others testified that there was giants in the land, and they said we were like grasshoppers in their sight. And yet God let them know here, I was the one that strengthened you for those battles. I was the one that won those battles for you. And then he said, also I brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you 40 years through the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorites, or the land of the Canaanites. That's synonymous there. And he said, and I raised up of your sons for prophets, and for your young men for Nazarites. Is it not even thus, O ye children of Israel, saith the Lord? And then he throws this but in there at the end of that. He said, and he comes back and he said, I gave you prophets, I gave you Nazarites, people that were actually set apart for my service, and they were good people, and they walked among you, and they were examples of the faith, and yet then this word but comes in there. But you gave the Nazarites wine to drink, which was a no-no. They were, from the day of their birth, they were not supposed to drink. I think about, as I was looking at this, I was thinking about Samson and all that how far out in left field he got on so many different things, and a lot of that was due to drinking, and it just led him astray. Excuse me. And he said, and then you commanded the prophets not to even prophesy, not to say the words that I gave them to say to you. And you did that. And all this it's justifying the judgment that has been passed on these people and that was fixing to come and hit them. And he said, and then God said, you know, I've had enough of it. He said, behold, in verse 13, he says, behold, I am pressed under you as a cart is pressed that is full of sheaves. He said, I am overloaded with your sin. I've overloaded with your conduct, and I've just had it. I'm not putting up with this anymore. And then in verses 14 and 15, it's interesting in those two verses, he lists another 7 signs of panic when Jerusalem falls. And really, bearing in mind here that there was the countryside had pretty much already fallen. They had, if we go back into 2 Kings and look at that, we would see where Sennacherib had laid siege to the capital of the northern kingdom, or was going to, for 3 months, I think. Don't quote me on that, but they were surrounded. They were boxed up in there, and he said, when the time comes, and it was going to come shortly, he said, the flight shall perish with the swift, and the strong shall not strengthen his force, neither shall the mighty deliver himself. And he goes on there in those next 2 verses, and he talks about how that even the army is not going to, the military is not going to protect you when this happens, that the very bravest of those people will cut and run. They won't have any, they won't have the morale or the strength to resist the judgment that's coming, that there'll just not be any way. And he goes on and he talks about that, and in chapter 3 and 4, he goes on again. That'll be another lesson for another time. But yet we see these things, in chapter 3, verse 1, he begins to talk about both the northern and the southern kingdom in this. But this is just gloom and doom for the 10 northern tribes, and once this is done, they'll be gone. We can talk about that more later, if you go back in the book of Revelations. But for now, we're going to stop and call that lesson here for today. And what does it say to us, though? That we don't have. I think the thing that it says that God can be pushed too far. We live in a day of grace, the dispensation of grace, the church age, and we think that God is always going to kind of wink at the things that we do, and God does not. He has a stalling point where he's had enough of that, and that's what this says. So anyway, you guys keep coming back, and we'll look at this some more later on. And we appreciate you listening, appreciate your viewers and the comments, and you guys have a good one. We'll see you later.